All right, so let's jump into this. This is a big one, right? The fall of the Roman Empire. Everyone's heard of it.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like a historical mystery that everyone wants to solve. You sent me some really cool stuff to look over for this deep dive, by the way.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that we're not just going to stick with those same old tired explanations, are we?
No, definitely not. I mean, it looks like we're going...
Oh, it's lead pipes or whatever.
Yeah, beyond lead pipes. We're looking at climate change, all sorts of diseases, even how Rome dealt with, well, barbarians.
Right. It's like, how could this huge, powerful empire just disappear?
Right. It's like, how could this huge, powerful empire just disappear?
Well, and that's the thing. It didn't just vanish overnight. That's one of the biggest myths we need to debunk right away. This wasn't some quick collapse. It was a really...
Okay, yeah.
So where do we even start?
Well, a lot of people think there was just one single cause, right? Like one bad emperor or one big battle that did it. But looking at all this research, it's clearly way more complicated than that.
It's like what causes a plane to crash. It's never just one thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. A much better analogy is like, imagine a Jenga tower. You can carefully pull out a few blocks,
Yeah.
and it'll still be standing.
Right.
But as you keep taking away those supporting pieces, eventually, boom, the whole thing becomes unstable and comes crashing down.
Oh, I like that. So we're talking about a system failure. All those different problems, those weaknesses just building up over time.
Precisely. And figuring out what those weaknesses were. Well, that's the real challenge. And honestly, historians even disagree about when the decline really started. Some think it goes all the way back to the 2nd century CE with Emperor Commodus.
Ah, Commodus.
Yeah.
The gladiator emperor. I've seen that movie.
Right. But others say, no, it was much later, like with Constantine the Great in the 4th century.
Well, that's a pretty big difference, right? A couple hundred years. It makes you wonder, what does decline even mean? Like, was there a specific moment? I mean, the stuff you sent mentioned this idea of late antiquity, which is like more about a slow transformation than a sudden crash.
That's a great point. And honestly, it's a much better way to think about it, in my opinion, at least. We're talking about huge shifts in society, politics, even the environment. It's more like, I don't know, like a caterpillar slowly turning into a butterfly. It's a long process with different stages.
Okay, yeah. That's a good one. So not a sudden crash, more like a metamorphosis.
Mm.
But if we're talking about things that are usually left out of those big Roman Empire movies, the research dives into some really unexpected stuff. Climate change, for example.
Right. Not exactly what you picture when you think of gladiators and chariots.
Not at all. And then there are those disease outbreaks, like the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian.
Oh, yeah. Those pandemics were absolutely brutal. Millions of deaths across the empire. Just imagine the impact on everything, right? The economy, people's ability to pay taxes, even the military's ability to, protect the borders. It was like a 1-2 punch that really weakened the empire's foundations.
Wow. It makes you wonder how much of history is really driven by these big, almost invisible forces, right? Things that are totally outside of human control. It's almost humbling in a way. But, okay, we can't talk about the fall of Rome without talking about those barbarian migrations, right? Those hordes sweeping in from the east.
Right. But it wasn't quite as simple as, like, these barbarian hordes just overwhelming Rome, And the sources we're looking at, they actually paint a much more nuanced picture. You had huge groups like the Goths, the Huns, the Alans, and they were being pushed by all sorts of factors. Climate change, pressure from other groups further east. It was a complex situation.
Right. They weren't just, like, mindless invaders. They had their own reasons.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that Rome had a long history of, you could even say, working with these so-called barbarian groups. This was a system they called receptio.
Receptio? What's that?
It basically means receiving or accepting. Rome would actually incorporate these groups into their military and society, sometimes through alliances, sometimes, maybe more through force or coercion. It was a way of managing those pressures on their borders.
So it was like a way of controlling them, but also maybe being influenced by them, like a two-way street.
Exactly. And for a long time, it worked. But then things started to break down.
Okay, so we've got climate change, disease outbreaks, these massive migrations. It's like the empire is being squeezed from every direction.
Yeah.
But I know there were also problems brewing on the inside, right? Like Rome was fighting itself as well.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest internal challenges was political instability, just constant power struggles, assassinations, emperors being overthrown left and right, especially during the crisis of the 3rd century. I mean...
Whoa. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It definitely was. I mean, imagine trying to run an empire when you're constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering who's going to stab you in the back next. It's no wonder things started to fall apart.
Yeah, and didn't some emperor try to fix this with that tetrarchy thing? Like dividing the empire into 4 parts?
Oh, yeah, Diocletian. He came to power in the late 3rd century and was basically like, okay, this isn't working. We need a new system. So he divides the empire, hoping it would make things more stable.
So it was like 4 emperors for the price of 1. Did it actually work?
Well, it did for a little while. But like most things in Roman history, it gets complicated. You know, personal ambitions got in the way, rivalries flared up, and eventually the whole system collapses.
And back to civil war.
Oh, yeah. Right back into the thick of it. And that's the problem with all this infighting, right? It makes it almost impossible to deal with those threats coming from the outside. It's like you're trying to fight off a pack of wolves while you're also wrestling with your siblings.
Okay, yeah, I get that. So we've got climate change, disease, migrations, political instability. It's like a perfect storm of bad news. But I'm guessing all of this was pretty rough on the empire's finances, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Constant wars to defend those borders, a growing bureaucracy, corruption.
Right, all that stuff costs money.
A lot of money. And
Yeah.
so the empire ends up facing a serious financial crisis.
So what did they do? I mean, how do you fix an empire that's basically gone bankrupt?
Well, they tried different things, but it was tough. One of the things they did was what we call debasing the currency. They started putting less and less precious metal in their coins.
Ah, so it's like you're paying for stuff with monopoly money. I can see how that would cause problems.
Exactly. It leads to inflation. The economy gets even worse. It's a vicious cycle.
Okay, so we got this incredible web of interconnected problems. Climate change, political instability, financial meltdown. But there's one more really big piece of the puzzle that we need to talk about. The rise of Christianity. How does that fit into all of this?
That's a great question, and one that we'll definitely dive into. It's a topic that often gets oversimplified and misunderstood.
Okay, so more nuance needed. Got it. But I think that's a good place to pause for now. Let's let our listeners take a break, absorb all of this, and we'll come back and unpack the rest of this Roman Empire puzzle.
Sounds good to me. Welcome back. So we've been digging into what brought down the Roman Empire, and I think we're all starting to see it wasn't just one simple thing, right?
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, it's amazing how all this stuff we've talked about, the climate, those plagues, even Rome's own politics, all played a part. But before we move on, I'm really curious about Christianity. It just seems like such a huge force during this whole period, and it's not always clear what role it played.
Oh, yeah. Christianity and the Roman Empire, that's a whole other deep dive in itself.
Right. I mean, some people say it was a big reason for the empire's decline, like it weakened those traditional Roman values or shifted resources away from the state.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, but honestly, I think it's a bit of an oversimplification.
Okay, but didn't the Romans, persecute Christians? Wouldn't that make them stronger, not weaker? I'm kind of confused about that part.
I get it. It's messy. But what's important to remember is that Christianity didn't just pop up overnight. It took centuries to really take hold. And its relationship with the Roman state was, well, let's just say it was complicated.
It's complicated how?
Well, you had periods where they were tolerated, even supported. Then you'd have these waves of persecution. It was really back and forth.
So it was more of a slow burn, a gradual change in the religious landscape, not just this sudden clash of civilizations that brought the whole empire down.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have all this stuff happening within Christianity itself. I mean, there were debates about what they believed, who should be in charge, how they should interact with the Roman government. It was a whole internal struggle going on at the same time.
Wow, so it's like all this drama playing out within Christianity while the empire itself is dealing with everything else we've talked about.
It's a lot. And honestly, it shows how multi-layered history really is. We can't just isolate one thing and say, aha, this caused that. It's all connected.
Okay, so it's not as simple as saying, Christianity caused the fall of Rome or whatever.
No, not at all. But it was definitely a big part of the story. And speaking of stories, I think we need to circle back to some of the political stuff we were talking about earlier. Like, after that tetrarchy thing fell apart, did things ever really calm down?
Yeah, what happened next? Did they find a new emperor or something?
Well, the short answer is no, not really. The instability just kept going. You have this constant backstabbing, revolts, emperors being deposed left and right. It's almost hard to keep track of it all.
It's like, those reality TV shows where everyone's just trying to grab power and eliminate the competition.
Yeah, except with real swords and way higher stakes.
Okay, that's a little scary. But didn't some people try to fix things? Like, were there any leaders who saw what was happening and tried to turn things around?
Oh, yeah, there were definitely individuals who stepped up, tried to restore some order, but it often felt like they were, I don't know, swimming upstream against a raging current. It was an uphill battle.
But didn't those sources you sent mention some specific names, like some key figures who tried to make a difference in all this chaos?
Absolutely. One of the most interesting ones is Emperor Theodosius I. He ruled in the late 4th century and really tried to stabilize things, both militarily and politically.
So he was like the guy trying to put out all the fires. What kind of problems was he dealing with?
Oh, man, where do I even start? You had constant threats on the borders from various groups, internal rebellions popping up, and even arguments and conflicts between different Christian factions.
So basically everything was on fire.
Pretty much. And it got to the point where Theodosius was relying heavily on barbarian troops to help fight his battles, which is kind of ironic.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like you're relying on the people you're supposed to be fighting off.
Yeah. It definitely shows how desperate things were getting. And speaking of interesting decisions, Theodosius also decided to make Christianity the official religion of the empire.
Really? Wow. So he goes from persecuting Christians to making it like the state religion.
It was a huge shift. And it shows how Christianity was really becoming the dominant force, at least culturally, in the Roman world. But it also created its own set of problems because now you have all these different Christian groups competing for power and influence.
Yeah, it seems like every solution just created more problems. But what about that other name you mentioned, Stilicho? He was a general, right?
Oh, Stilicho. He was a fascinating character. He was a Roman general, but actually of Vandal origin. He rose to power at the end of the 4th century and became incredibly influential. I mean, this guy was basically trying to hold the Western Roman Empire together single-handedly.
Like the ultimate defender of Rome. So what happened? Did he succeed?
Well, he was fighting battles on all sides, literally. He was trying to push back the Visigoths under Alaric, who were getting bolder. And at the same time, he was navigating the crazy world of Roman politics where people were constantly plotting against him.
Man, that sounds stressful. It's like he was trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle on a tightrope.
Yeah, pretty much. But even with all his skill and determination, he couldn't hold back the tide forever. And that brings us to one of the most iconic events in Roman history, the sack of Rome in 410 CE.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's heard of that. That's got to be like the ultimate symbol of the fall of Rome, right?
It was definitely a huge shock. I mean, for centuries, people thought of Rome as this invincible city, the eternal city. And to see it sacked by, barbarians, it just shattered that illusion of invincibility.
Yeah, it must have felt like the end of the world for people back then.
Oh, absolutely. But here's the thing. It wasn't actually the end.
Wait, what? But I thought Rome fell in 476. What happened in between?
That's what we're going to talk about next. Because the story of the Roman Empire doesn't end with the sack of Rome. It's a lot more complicated than that.
All right, so we're in the final stretch of our deep dive into the fall of the Roman Empire. We've talked about all these different factors that weakened it, but, it's still kind of hard to wrap my head around how we get from a sacked Rome to, the official end.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting, because 476 CE, that date everyone throws around as the fall of Rome. It wasn't some sudden dramatic event.
Right. It's not like someone just flipped a switch and poof, no more Roman Empire. Right.
Exactly. The sources we've been looking at, they really emphasize that this date, it was more like a culmination, culmination of all these long-term trends we've been talking about.
So more like a slow fade out than a hard stop.
Yeah, I like that. It's like, think about a star that's slowly burning out. It doesn't just disappear instantly. It gradually loses its brightness until eventually it's so faint we can't see it anymore.
Okay, I could see that. But even though the Roman Empire, officially ended, it's not like its influence just vanished overnight, right?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the Roman Empire wasn't just about emperors and legions and stuff. It was a whole way of life, culture, law, architecture, all these things that had been built up over centuries.
So what happened to all that stuff after 476? Did it just get, swept under the rug?
Not at all. In fact, the sources mention these things called rump states. Basically, these were areas like Dalmatia, the domain of Soissons, places where Roman traditions and ways of governing continued even after the Western Roman Empire, quote unquote, fell.
So it was like these little pieces of Rome still hanging on, even as everything else was changing.
Exactly. It was a messy, fragmented transition. And you see this in other ways, too. Like, take language, for example. Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, it didn't disappear. It actually evolved into all these different languages that we speak today, French, Spanish, Italian.
Oh, so the languages I'm learning, like those are directly descended from ancient Rome.
Pretty amazing, right? That's just one example. You also have Roman law, which was super influential. The whole idea of codifying laws, having a system of legal procedures that all came from Rome. And that stuff, it formed the basis for legal systems all over Europe and beyond.
So the way we think about justice, about having a fair legal system, that's a Roman thing.
To a large extent, yeah. And think about all those incredible structures the Romans built. Roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters. Many of those things are still standing today.
Yeah. I mean, every time I see a picture of the Colosseum or something, it's just mind-blowing to think about how old that is, and that it's still there.
It's a testament to their engineering skills, for sure, but it's also a reminder of how they shaped the physical landscape and how those structures, they became symbols of Roman power and civilization.
Okay, but what about the people who took over, after the Western Roman Empire fell? Did they just, forget about Rome and do their own thing?
Not really. In fact, you see a lot of Roman influence even in the way these so-called barbarian rulers, the way they governed, the way they organized their societies. They adopted a lot of Roman customs and traditions. It was like they recognized that there was a certain prestige, a certain cachet associated with being Roman.
So it wasn't just a military takeover, it was also a cultural exchange.
Exactly. It was a mix of conquering and absorbing Roman and barbarian cultures. They blended together, they influenced each other, and they created something new.
It's like history is never a clean break.
Yeah.
It's always building on what came before.
That's such a great point. And it's why this whole topic, the fall of the Roman Empire, it's so endlessly fascinating because it's not just a story of collapse. It's also a story of continuity, of adaptation, of transformation.
Wow, that's deep. I mean, we started out talking about the fall of Rome, but it sounds like in a lot of ways Rome never really fell, right? It just morphed into something else.
Exactly. Its legacy lived on in so many ways, and it continues to influence us today. I mean, think about it. Our languages, our legal systems, even our ideas about government and citizenship, they all have roots in ancient Rome.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it that way. It's like all these threads connecting us back to this ancient civilization.
And that's the beauty of history, right? It's not just about the past. It's about understanding who we are today and how we got here.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. We started out talking about lead pipes and gladiators, and we ended up exploring the legacy of one of the most influential empires in history.
Yeah, we definitely went deep on this one. I hope our listeners enjoyed the ride.
I'm sure they did. And I hope it inspires them to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those minds engaged. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.